Tradition calls him the third bishop of Rome, but the writer of 1 Clement never calls himself a bishop. In fact, he describes a church where the laity had to give their consent for leadership to be valid. In this video, I'm looking at 1 Clement to see that while local church leadership was certainly vital, it wasn't the sort that the later church insisted exists from the start. In the prior video on this topic, I looked at the New Testament testimony for apostolic succession. What I argued wasn't that the earliest congregations didn't have leaders appointed by the apostles, that they didn't have elders. They clearly did. But the claims for apostolic succession go far beyond just local churches had bishops. They assert a particular form and meaning to those elders, and I made the case that the evidence for those specific claims is clearly not in the New Testament. And for something that the church puts forth as absolutely essential, it should be there. I mentioned Father Francis Sullivan in that video as one who agrees that it's not in the New Testament, but also saying he accepts it as a development of history. And that, in a true sense, is where the divide is, not over what the New Testament teaches, but over whether later historical development should be treated as equally authoritative. So, in this video, I'm going to look at some of that history and see what it shows. One of the earlier letters we have is 1 Clement. This was a letter from Rome to Corinth, and there had been trouble in Corinth, namely, legitimate elders had been deposed. There was a coup, in other words. The writer never names himself, so Clement is who tradition ascribes as the author. Many believe that Clement was the third or fourth bishop of Rome, but the interesting thing about the letter is the author never makes a claim that he is a bishop. He never identifies himself as such. He writes to the Corinthians to encourage them to acknowledge that they've made a mistake, and they need to restore the legitimate elders. Clement says that those who have been blamelessly and holily serving had been removed, not those who have been validly ordained. The emphasis is on the life and service of these elders. The writer uses both bishop and presbyter in the letter. It should be uncontroversial, I think, that in the New Testament, bishop and presbyter refer to the same office. Although some have tried to make a case for a distinction already, the evidence isn't there. Quite the contrary, in fact. In Acts 20, when Paul calls the Ephesian elders to the beach to bid them farewell, he calls them both bishops and presbyters. In Titus 1, when Paul gives instructions on the appointment to office, there also he refers to the same office by both terms. There's little question that in the New Testament they are the same. And in chapter 42, verse 2, Clement says that the apostles appointed those, when they had proved them by the Spirit to be bishops and deacons, unto them that should believe. In other words, Clement doesn't mention presbyters as a distinct office. He's in accord with the New Testament pattern where bishop and presbyter are the same. In the letter, the writer urges the Corinthians to restore the deposed presbyters. In other words, Corinth had a plural oversight. If Rome had a single bishop at this point in history, it's strange that the writer of 1 Clement wouldn't say so and mention a single bishop or a ruling bishop. The tone throughout is one of entreaty, of exhortation, and an appeal to shared examples that they both knew: Abraham, Job, the prophets, and Paul. Grammatically, the author uses the hortatory, subjunctive, and imperative moods in the context of a communal appeal. Clement doesn't invoke any Petrine prerogative or Rome's prerogative. His appeals are scripture, that is, what the apostles had instituted. The letter is collective counsel, not episcopal decree. Roman Catholic scholars acknowledge this as well. I noted Father Francis Sullivan as one who affirms that Rome had a plural oversight for the first several decades. The patristic scholar Michael Holmes, in his preface to 1 Clement, in his edition of the Apostolic Fathers, notes this as well. He says that tradition identifies him as the third bishop of Rome after Peter, but this is unlikely because the office of monarchical bishop, in the sense intended by this later tradition, does not appear to have existed at Rome in this time. And the historian Eamon Duffy says this too. For all the indications are that there was no single bishop at Rome for almost a century after the deaths of the apostles. I might also add that the shepherd of Hermas and the Didache both testify to a plural oversight in the local church. They both speak of multiple elders over one congregation. We're far removed from a diocesan model where a single bishop is over a group of churches. I gave evidence earlier from 1 Clement 42 why I think he doesn't distinguish bishop from presbyter. In chapter 44 of the letter, the writer says this, "For it will be no small sin for us if we depose from the bishop's office those who have offered the gifts blamelessly and in holiness. Blessed are those presbyters who have gone on ahead, who took their departure at a mature and fruitful age, for they need no longer fear that someone may remove them from their established place." I can anticipate someone making the argument that language of offering the gifts indicates something sacramental, something about the Eucharist. That is, an assumption that the Eucharist is a sacrificial offering in a technical sense, and that its validity depends on a sacramentally ordained priesthood in apostolic succession. 1 Clement does have language of sacrifice, but the nature of it is moral and spiritual. In chapter 18 of the letter, he says this, "For if you had desired sacrifice, I would have given it. But in whole burnt offerings you will take no pleasure. The sacrifice for God is a broken spirit. A broken and humbled heart God will not despise." And later in chapter 52, and again he says, "Sacrifice to God a sacrifice of praise, and pay your vows to the Most High, and call upon me in the day of your affliction, and I will deliver thee, and you will glorify me. For a sacrifice unto God is a broken spirit." In Clement's usage, offering the gifts functions as a general description of faithful ministry. Even where early Christians use sacrificial language, it is fluid and often metaphorical, not yet a clearly defined doctrine of priestly Eucharistic sacrifice tied to apostolic succession. Justin Martyr said, "Prayers and giving of thanks, when offered by worthy men, are the only perfect and well-pleasing sacrifices to God." The Epistle of Barnabas also says, "A sacrifice to God is a broken heart. An aroma pleasing to the Lord is a heart that glorifies its Maker." Significantly, in a passage dealing with the removal of bishops, Clement never mentions the Eucharist, never refers to bread and wine, and never raises any concern about the validity of sacraments. If that were his concern, this would be the place to say it. In chapters 40 and 41, the writer invokes an extended analogy to the Levitical priesthood, but he doesn't do so to say, in the same way, bishops preside at the sacrifice of the Eucharist. In fact, Clement never mentions the Eucharist anywhere in the letter. Rather, his appeal is for order and the decorum of the appointed role of presbyter. In other words, just as the Levitical priests had their role, so also bishops have their roles in shepherding the church. It's as if he is saying, you Corinthians have behaved poorly by removing them from this role. This isn't an argument for a sacramental ontology. The analogy is about respecting divinely ordered roles, not about bishops mediating sacrifice. If Clement understood the episcopal office to provide sacramental legitimacy, that conclusion would have followed naturally from his use of the Levitical analogy, but he doesn't make that connection. Some say the seed of this idea is here, if even unstated, but arguments from silence run both ways. If this connection was as central as later tradition claims, its absence from a letter, specifically about the legitimacy of church leaders, is significant. What the text of chapter 44 also doesn't say is that the succession of office conveys a special sacramental character that makes worship valid depending on a particular ordination lineage. Some may want to infer that because Clement uses the term liturgos, from which we get liturgy, that we can assume this. But how is the word used in the New Testament? We see prophets and teachers in Antioch ministering and fasting before the Lord. Ministering here is liturgos, but note it is the prophets and teachers, not bishops, that are mentioned. If liturgos carried an inherently episcopal sacramental meaning, we would expect it to attach to the episcopal office. But it attaches here to offices the Roman Catholic and Orthodox churches do not include in their succession at all. In Romans 15, Paul says, if the Gentiles have come to share in their spiritual blessings, that is, of the Jews, they ought also to be of service to them in material blessings. Service is liturgos. What he's talking about is the financial support of the church at Jerusalem. That financial support was communal in nature, non-sacramental. My point is that when Clement speaks of those who succeed a prior leader in the local church, it is not implying sacramental authority. It is a succession of office within a local congregation, not a metaphysical pipeline of grace. There's still no evidence of bishops exercising authority beyond one local congregation. His language doesn't imply a chain of custody idea that legitimacy is tied to this man being ordained by that man. Once more, evidence from the Didache is notable, where we read, appoint for yourselves bishops and deacons. This is markedly different from what we find with Cyprian in the 3rd century, who does make a claim of sacramental validity tied to succession. But that's not here in Clement. To return to the point that Clement is making, he's speaking about deposing some from the bishop's office, and then in the following verses he talks about presbyters who no longer need to worry about someone removing them from their place. I think it's clear he is talking about the same office. One objection is to say that things were fluid in those days and that plural presbyters doesn't exclude the possibility of a single ruling bishop. But this is reading a later polity back into Clement. The first documentary evidence of a single bishop over one congregation is not until Ignatius, who wrote later than the commonly held date for 1 Clement. Whether each congregation was led by a group of presbyters or one head bishop is a separate question I'll take up when I discuss Ignatius, but any hierarchy is unattested in Clement. And again, my point here has been that for something the church says is vital to the very being of the church, it should have stronger evidence than this may be possible. Some, I'm sure, will raise the point that prior to this, in the same chapter, Clement has said of the apostles, for this reason, therefore, having received complete foreknowledge, they appointed the leaders mentioned earlier, and afterwards gave the offices a permanent character. That is, if they should die, other approved men should succeed to their ministry. That is from 1 Clement chapter 44, verse 2, and he is clearly talking about bishops in that verse. When he says the leaders mentioned earlier, that goes back to chapter 42, where he said that the apostles appointed bishops. Now and I think every Protestant can affirm that God set forth a pattern of leadership in the church. And this is what Clement is talking about when he speaks of the offices having a permanent character. The idea that a local church would be without shepherds, without leaders, is not something we find in the New Testament. But we should note well here that what Clement is talking about is local church leadership. That is, multiple bishops governing one church as a board of elders, a group. Here, too, the evidence Clement shows is a pattern that has been set aside by churches claiming apostolic succession. Bishops now govern a region, a diocese, several churches rather than one. The question is not whether development happened. It did, but whether such development are normative and essential for the church's existence, especially when they are not clearly shown in the New Testament. It is significant as well that in 1 Clement 44:3, he says that those who held the office were appointed with the consent of the whole church. In Clement's view, the people's corporate recognition and consent are necessary for rightly appointed bishops. If someone is going to appeal to 1 Clement for a defense of apostolic succession, why is the consent of the laity completely missing from it today and has been missing for many centuries? By what authority has that element of ordination been removed? In chapter 47, Clement has said it's disgraceful that the presbyters were removed by one or two persons. In other words, there was a faction that had done this, not the whole congregation. His appeal that the elders had been appointed with the consent of the whole gives real weight to this corporate role. In other words, if someone were to say that later tradition determined that the whole church is giving consent through the hierarchy, that this is now how we do episcopal appointments, that would be a departure from what Clement shows. What we see in 1 Clement is not permission by proxy. Clement's remedy isn't simply obey your bishops. It's the faction that acted unilaterally against the will of the many must repent. The error lies precisely in bypassing the will of the whole body. Finally, I want to again bring this back to the true authority for apostolic succession, historical development, not New Testament evidence. The way the later church developed the idea imposes an interpretive framework on this earlier evidence. An understanding of sacramental validity tied to apostolic succession didn't emerge until later. But because it did emerge, the earlier evidence, such as 1 Clement, tends to be read as containing the seeds of it, even if it's not stated. So, if you're a Protestant and you doubt apostolic succession is really here in 1 Clement, you're not ignoring obvious patristic evidence if you remain skeptical. Clement shows us a body of elders who governed one congregation, but he doesn't show us laying on of hands or monoepiscopacy, nor any connection between leaders and sacraments. If we don't see apostolic succession functioning this way, the way it's often described today, when do we see the start of it? When do we see it begin to take this form? In the next video, I'll look at Ignatius.